Good afternoon, and welcome to the Industry Needs by the Borough, the state of Brooklyn and Staten Island. My name is Jose Ortiz, and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you all to our members that have joined us this afternoon. A special thank you to our sponsors, Amazon, Google, Ponce Bank, and Verizon, for supporting this series. NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYC ETC's membership is composed of 180 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Today, in this second installment in our four-part Industry Needs by Borough series, we'll discuss the state of Brooklyn and Staten Island and strategize on measures being undertaken to keep businesses open and workers employed. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a great panel of leaders that represent business interests in Brooklyn and Staten Island. Before we get started, all participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of our communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get Brooklyn and Staten Island workers back employed. However, before we hear from our panel, we'll hear first from James Parrott, the Director of the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School and Senior Fellow at NYC ETC, who will provide a labor market update on the boroughs of Brooklyn and Staten Island. James, floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you. Joey, it's good to be here. I'd like to take a few minutes to give an overview of how New York City's economy and labor market have fared during the pandemic, and in particular, we'll look at data on Staten Island and Brooklyn. Lena, if I could have the next slide. Just to give you a quick overview. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how the COVID economic dislocation is different from a usual recession or business cycle downturn. Look at how jobs and residents are affected. The Queens economies, the Brooklyn and Staten Island economies have two dimensions that we want to look at: the jobs that are located in each of those boroughs, and then what's happened to the jobs that the residents who live in each of those boroughs have, and how those were affected. So this will lead us to look at which workers were affected. We also want to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has reshaped the city's economy and its jobs and what the economic and labor market outlook. And then I want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about what I think are some special policy needs to help the labor market get back on track following the COVID disruption. Next slide, please. So this chart shows the monthly employment levels and how far down they were compared to the pre-pandemic level of February of 2020. New York City is the gray line at the bottom, and the national average is the blue line at the top. It's clear from this that the job decline in the first couple of months through April of last year was much steeper in New York City than in the nation overall. And while there's been some recovery, it's been fairly gradual and drawn out over several months. And there have been some ups and downs in that period. There was some recovery in the fall of last year, and then we were pretty much in a holding pattern from October through January as the second surge took off. Since February of this year, there's been pretty steady job growth, and New York City has kept pace proportionally with the nation, but we're still lagging far behind. Now, just a word on how the COVID dislocation differs from a business cycle downturn. Usually, in a business cycle downturn, it begins with large corporations cutting back on their spending, on their employment. Large companies tend to pay higher wages. When you take that consumer power out of the economy, that trickles down into local consumption jobs, which then also eventually get hit in the process. But in New York City's recent economic history, going back the past 30 years or so, there's been sort of an equal impact on the high-paying corporate-dominated sectors versus the lower-paying service sectors. In the pandemic economy, of course, the economic dislocation stems from the public health mandate for business restrictions, which have really had a concentrated impact on leisure and hospitality, other local services, retailing, and then activities like construction and manufacturing that can't be done on a remote basis. So the industries affected and the workers affected are a lot different than in a normal business cycle downturn. So through June of this year, the most recent data, New York City is still down almost 11% in employment from February of last year. That's more than 3.5 times the 2.9 or 3% drop at the national level. And of course, New York City has been hit much harder than other parts in New York State. If you look at the rest of New York State, the yellow line here, it's just a little bit below, a little bit worse off than the nation overall. Much better off, though, than New York City. Next slide. Here, this slide compares New York City's decline with the other 19 largest largest US cities. Again, New York City hit much harder than most other cities. The cities that are close behind New York City tend to be on the West Coast or the East Coast: San Francisco, LA, Philadelphia, San Diego, San Jose. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have cities in the South that where the impact has been much more moderated and is even below the national level overall. The next slide has a lot of detail on the industries. And I group these into 3 categories that I found useful to understand the pandemic's uneven impact. So the first category is the essential industries. So that's mainly healthcare, also includes government. Then the face-to-face industry category that has borne the brunt of the decline. So this includes leisure and hospitality, retail, trade, local services, arts and entertainment, construction and manufacturing, and so on. So this is where the impact has been concentrated. At the other extreme in terms of the impact is the remote working industries. And these are the large corporation dominated industries: finance, insurance, professional services, information, that usually get hit first in a business cycle downturn. But they've been, in this economic event, have largely been spared a lot of job loss. Many of these workers able to pivot and work remotely. Many of these companies, tech companies are included in this category, have actually prospered and done very well in the pandemic. So you can really see in one of these middle columns that show that the percent employment decline from February of 20 to June of this year. New York City overall with 10.4% decline. Face-to-face industries, 20% decline, many times greater than the 4% decline in remote working or the 2.5% decline in the essential industry category. The final column shows the extent to which jobs lost in the first 2 months of the pandemic through April of last year have been recouped as of June of this year. Overall, the cities gained back about half of the jobs lost. And that's true in the face-to-face industry category. And you can see the essential industry category has gained back 70% of the job losses. The remote working category has gained back only 35%. But again, keep in mind that they didn't lose as much in the first 2 months as the face-to-face industry category. The next slide shows some industry detail along these lines for Brooklyn and Staten Island. Now, keep in mind, and we're going to talk in a minute about how the overall pandemic employment displacements have been concentrated in jobs located in Manhattan. So proportionally, fewer jobs in Brooklyn and Staten Island have been lost as a result of the pandemic. But of course, the people who hold those jobs in Manhattan tend to live across the 5 boroughs. So many residents in Brooklyn and Staten Island have been dislocated, even if jobs in those boroughs haven't been. But here you can still see for the leisure and hospitality sectors in both Brooklyn and Queens, a really sharp roughly 30% employment decline. In other services, this includes nail salons and barbershops, local repair services, pretty heavy impact. And you also see in the finance sector and professional business services in Brooklyn, a pretty significant 10% employment decline. Certainly a decline of that magnitude indicates, any period of very severe recessionary impact. So those sectors in Brooklyn and Staten Island, you pretty much see the same picture, have been hard hit. Now, look at these cells that are yellow shaded here on the right, and you'll see something that's unique in New York City, an industry that has actually grown pretty significantly since the pandemic. And this is this broad category, because that's what the data availability allows, of trade, transportation, and utilities. What this means in Staten Island is really the warehouse sector. So this is largely the Amazon and related distribution centers that have expanded their business during the pandemic. So this is really unusual. This is the first time I've seen this, at any borough level in New York City, a pretty significant 16% employment increase during the pandemic, going against the tide. And of course, that has moderated Staten Island's overall employment loss in the downturn. Next slide. So again, I've talked about how the employment displacement has been concentrated in Manhattan through December, which is the most recent period for the borough level employment data. 72% of jobs lost in New York City, lost in Manhattan. Again, heavily concentrated in leisure and hospitality, and those industries that support office workers who normally work in Manhattan but have been working remotely elsewhere during most of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So here we're shifting to look at the workers and how they've been affected. So not surprisingly, given the concentrated impact in low-paid service industries, workers of color in New York City have borne the brunt. 75% of the job losses citywide. This chart shows the likelihood that someone in these categories has been dislocated relative to the average worker by that category. So workers with a high school education or less, 23% more likely to be dislocated. A worker with a 4-year college degree, 20% less likely. Young workers, very heavily impacted. Foreign-born immigrants, much more heavily impacted. Low-wage workers, much more heavily impacted. Higher-wage workers, much less likely to have been displaced. Next slide, please. So we tried to look at what the occupations and industries where residents of Brooklyn and Staten Island live. And you can see that in both cases, 57% of all workers work in the essential industries, much smaller shares in the other two categories. Next slide. This is the same data set here where we're looking at pre-pandemic of all of the workers in Brooklyn, 62% are persons of color, and Staten Island, 36%, 58% in Brooklyn, less than a 4-year college degree, 62% in Staten Island, and so on. And you can see how these demographic impacts vary by category: essential, face-to-face, remote working, and so on. So you get the picture here that in terms of the impact on residents of Brooklyn and Staten Island, those in the face-to-face industries, this gives you an idea of the demographics of those groups and who's most likely to be affected living in those boroughs. Next slide. I'd like to spend a minute just talking about this question that we've seen a lot about in the press, and that I know business leaders like Randy have heard a lot about from their membership. That is difficult to recruit workers back in this period, despite the fact that unemployment is so high, and we're still short almost 500,000 jobs compared to February of last year. I've tried to look carefully at this issue. It's been a very unsettled labor market overall, and period in people's lives generally. So that's important to keep in mind. What's interesting, and we don't have the data at a New York City level, but at a national level, there are record quit rates, which are really high in low-paying industries like restaurants and retail jobs, and so on. So high quit rates at the same time that there are a lot of job openings, indicating that workers are sort of reassessing what their employment prospects are, taking stock of how their fortunes have been affected over the past year or more, what effect on their families and so on. The lack of availability of affordable childcare has also been a constraint in keeping people home, not able to go back to work. Continuing concerns about unvaccinated persons. New York State's partial unemployment system didn't help the situation. It's unduly complicated. It makes it hard for workers to figure out how they're going to fare, what percent of their unemployment benefits they're going to lose if they go back to work, but only on a part-time basis, because that's all their employer has need for at this point. Overall, I think, to some extent, there's a positive dimension of this, that this hesitancy about returning to work also reflects workers rethinking what their work and career options are. And in the long run, this should be beneficial to the economy. If people end up in better situations, if they decide to make investments in their own education and skill set, they're going to be more productive. They're going to help the city's economy grow over the long term. I think this is really, mainly a temporary phenomenon. Keep in mind also that while at this point, 2 million New York State residents are on unemployment insurance of one form or another, that number is going to dwindle really rapidly when the federal unemployment benefits and the day after Labor Day. We're going to go from 2 million people on unemployment insurance in New York State to under 500,000 pretty much overnight in mid-September. Next slide, and I'll start to wrap up here. In addition to just the sheer magnitude of job losses that we've talked about, there's a record number of people who've been unemployed for a long period of time. And a lot of research shows that it's really hard to reconnect long-term unemployed workers with the labor market. It's been a sharp rise in involuntary part-time unemployment. We talked about the problems that parents, particularly women, who've been out of the labor force by caregiving and child care responsibilities have in returning to the labor market, and of course, continuing concerns about health risk. Next slide. No one in New York, I think, is expecting a quick rebound to where we were before. We're starting to hear talk at a national level about how the economy has rebounded, but the labor market hasn't. And also keep in mind the fact that New York City was hit several times harder in terms of job dislocation than the US. These are the IBO projections on employment, which show that basically it's going to take us until 2024 before that last orange bar gets above zero and we're back to a pre-pandemic employment level. The next chart shows a related version of this in how long it's taken us to recover lost jobs in New York City in prior economic downturns compared to the pandemic economy in yellow. Out of the last 3 economic downturns, it's taken us at least 38 months to get back to the pre-pandemic employment level. That means that at best, spring of 2023. But these prior downturns had a lot more moderate employment declines than the 20% we've experienced here. So I think this is the base case that we might be looking at. So in my assessment of this, special efforts are needed in the part of the city. And if we can have the final slide, and speak to this. I think we can't leave it to the market on its own to match dislocated workers, some of whose jobs are not going to come back. In other cases, the pandemic has accelerated changes like the e-commerce trend rapidly accelerated during the pandemic. And in other cases, there are pandemic specific changes to the economy that will have permanent impacts, will change the set of skill requirements needed. The tourism sector and hospitality will eventually recover. I'm not sure we're going to get back all of the restaurant jobs that we had in February of 2020 in the next 2 or 3 years. That sector provided a lot of job opportunities for people entering the labor market. So there's a need to reassess where new jobs are emerging, what the skill requirements are, how those are similar or different from the skill requirements of workers likely to be permanently dislocated or long-term unemployed. And we need to then apply workforce development policy, remedies, retraining, help people get credentials, return to school if that's in their best interest and career prospects to do that. We need to have, I think, a pretty massive economic and workforce intervention to prevent what the likely scenario is of years of elevated, that is double-digit unemployment rates for Black and brown and less educated workers in New York City. That's the likely scenario unless we intervene in a greater way than what's being contemplated right now. Let me stop at that point. I've taken too much time. Thank you for your patience.
That was really helpful and a sobering update. But thank you as always, my friend. Appreciate the update. We're now going to introduce our speakers, who are an incredible group of individuals leading innovative work in the business community in Brooklyn and Staten Island. First up is David Ehrenberg. He's the president and CEO of the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation. Next is Brian Licata, membership relations manager at the Staten Island Chamber of Commerce. Regina Meyer, president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, and Randy Piers, president and CEO of Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for joining us today. We're now just going to take a quick second to allow for you all to introduce yourself, your organization, and the role your organization plays in your borough's business community. And we're going to go in alphabetical order to make this simple. So David, you'll go first, followed by Brian, then Regina, and last but not least, Randy. David?
Sure. Hi, David Ehrenberg. I run the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It's a not-for-profit organization that runs the 300-acre campus on the Brooklyn waterfront. We, as a nonprofit, focus on creating a safe place for next-generation manufacturing companies in the borough, and then do a lot of work in connecting local residents to both the jobs that are available here at the Yard, as well as the skills required for those jobs, both of today and tomorrow.
Thanks, David.
Hi, I'm Brian Licata from the Staten Island Chamber of Commerce. I'm the membership relations manager. The Staten Island Chamber focuses two fronts. One, working with the business community to connect them with other businesses and with consumers. The other is to connect the labor market to the businesses. Our highest priority is making sure that we can build pipelines into the business community so that our local residents can take advantage of those.
Thanks, Brian. Regina?
Hi, I'm Regina Meyer, president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, which is a business advocacy group representing downtown Brooklyn, as well as the 3 business improvement districts here in downtown. Our focus is making sure downtown Brooklyn is a great mixed use neighborhood. And from a job perspective, that's incredibly important to our local economy as well as our overall economy. We focus a lot on hospitality jobs here in downtown and supporting the hospitality sector. And of course, also thinking about new job opportunities, especially relating new jobs to our incredible cluster of downtown Brooklyn colleges and universities, focusing on tech.
Thanks, Regina. And Randy?
Hi, everyone. Randy Piers, President and CEO of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. We're actually the largest chamber in New York State. We have 1,600 business members. I will say the last 16 months have not been about membership, but serving the entire borough. We're still a small business economy here in Brooklyn. Before the pandemic, 63,000 businesses, 84% of which had less than 10 employees. To put it in perspective, many of those customer-facing businesses, the ones in hospitality and the restaurant sector and others that James was referring to. So we've been doing a lot of work sort of borough-wide. Our sort of focus is, well, we've got this sort of bird's eye view in terms of the different neighborhoods. Different neighborhoods have been impacted in different ways. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But just happy to be here with my colleagues from Brooklyn. I want to give a shout out to Brian for holding down Staten Island and in what is right now a Brooklyn-centric panel. So Brian, kudos to you, my friend.
We only need one rep, so it's good.
Well, thanks again, all of you, for being with us. We're incredible partners and appreciate your perspective. So let's get into it. So what's your immediate reaction to the labor update from James? But also when thinking about that, how has the pandemic affected the business and workforce development landscape in Brooklyn and Staten Island? And how have your organizations adapted during and after the current pandemic and economic circumstances? So why don't we go in reverse order? Start with Randy.
Well, I'll tell you, it's been an extraordinary 16 months. And I know we all know this, but to put it in perspective, look, we've been through Sandy, we've been through 9/11, and we've been through sort of cyclical downturns. And I think that's what James was comparing some of the data to. Let's not forget a couple of things here. And this sometimes doesn't come out in the conversations. The reason some of our businesses have closed permanently, particularly our small businesses, the reason that some of our businesses of color have closed permanently, it's not because of bad business practices, but it's because government shut the businesses down, right? So let's be real and let's put this in perspective. It's an unnatural business cycle. And I think the results of which, as James sort of articulated, really do disproportionately impacted those businesses that you kind of have to roll up the gate, that are customer facing, and that really do make up a lot of the economy in both Brooklyn and Staten Island. So it doesn't surprise me the sectors that were hit the hardest. That being said, Brooklyn has shown surprising resiliency overall, right? And in part because our central business district in downtown Brooklyn is a mixed use district, and Regina, will tell you more about that. And it's helped weather the storm because we weren't overly reliant on office workers. A lot of the Brooklyn Chamber's time has really been spent on the ground doing recovery work, right? So our goal had been rapid recovery. I will say it wasn't rapid until recently, and now we've opened up in a significant way, but that's caused its own set of problems and challenges in the labor market, right? Including the fact that some of our small businesses can't or have not been able to staff up, and that's actually slowing the pace of the recovery itself. So I think there's a lot of sort of intertwined issues here, but I guess the main thing I want to say is that there really is no precedent, right? So the data that James sort of has put out there is really trying to explain a situation that we've never truly faced before in any context. And how we get out of it and how we sort of rebound is probably also going to be equally as unorthodox, right? So, more to come. I mean, we're just having this debate right now about to vaccinate or not to vaccinate and whether businesses should mandate that. Well, guess what? That question ties directly to the pace of recovery in some instances, right? As well as the potential reemergence of the Delta variant and what that's going to mean sort of long term. So there's still a lot of other variables that are out there that we're going to have to factor, and we won't really know fully the impact or how we get out of it until down the road sometime.
Feel free to jump in here, anyone.
Well, I would want to piggyback on Randy and say that health still comes first. And I think even when this panel was convened, we didn't have any idea that the Delta variant would hit New York City, and that the concerns we are now having is we obviously want school to be back in session after Labor Day, but now is there a question about that? I'm not spreading any rumors here, but I think it's what everyone has on their minds. So that being said, in terms of health, just moving to downtown Brooklyn, we've done everything we can to support the retail and hospitality sectors, and we've been lucky enough that retail has driven activity in downtown Brooklyn because of the essential nature of some of our retail and our location. But it is still our hospitality sector in terms of hotels and other tourism that has been hit hard, and we have to be cognizant of that. Because those hospitality jobs represent, for some people, the first step into the workforce. From that, we really are looking at our schools to reactivate downtown Brooklyn. And we're really happy that all of our colleges and universities are going to be down in person. And that will bring a lot of activity here. But we really have to keep continuing to plan for the long term. And the long term is reactivating our office sector and what investment needs to happen in our office sector to really serve Brooklyn. We've had successes in fit and starts in terms of the tech space. Obviously, we worked really hard last year to make sure REAP was reactivated and reinforced for Brooklyn and Queens and parts of Manhattan. So we continue to see investment. But honestly, moving into the next administration, I'm looking to make sure our new elected officials understand how important new investment for jobs is for downtown Brooklyn and Brooklyn as a whole. And that is across all sectors, but especially sectors where we haven't seen representation in terms of tech, in terms of possible connectivity to our hospitals and other university uses like research.
I mean, the data hit home. We've been following Burning Glass, and we've been looking at what's been coming out with Chimera, looking at all the different reports. And let's just really be frank, before the pandemic hit, hospitality, retail, and restaurants were struggling. They were struggling to find great talent anyway. We're not building pipelines into them, and they were at the lower level of the labor market. When the pandemic hit, we saw that those were the jobs that went away first. Obviously, those are the jobs most people are scared to go back to first, because some of them went and found jobs in other sectors. Some of them are scared to be out in front of all those people. And what we're seeing right now, as Randy pointed out, the chambers are engaging every business in their boroughs, whether they're members or not, trying to make sure that they can be sufficient and they can stay open. Nobody wants to see any business close, but every business right now is trying to find employees. And what we're seeing is that not only is it a buyer's market, an employer can post it. You have 20 different places posting the same thing. The job seeker has a lot of choice in this. They also have remote options, which is making it even harder for them to find something local. And then that has a cyclical effect where the other jobs that would rely on that worker being at their job, picking up coffee on the way to work, getting something for breakfast, sending their child to childcare, they're not spending that money like they normally would. So you can't just look at this as one sector at a time. You have to look at how these sectors are interdependent. And Staten Island is really unique in that we don't have large corporations. We're hospitality, retail. We've got lots of restaurants, great places to eat, and we're having a hard time finding the staff. And Joey, as we've talked to before, we lack the correct training programs to build the pipelines into these restaurants. And that's really what most of our businesses are looking for. How do we find and cultivate the future talent?
So from our perspective and trying to figure out something different to say since I'm going last, I think what we're seeing in our tenant companies where we have a pretty good sense of not only their rehiring process, but really exactly what roles they're looking for. I would just highlight something that James kind of mentioned, which is there's been a process at the Navy Yard across every industry in the city for many years, and in fact, going back for centuries of upskilling and upskilling and upskilling and upskilling over time. And I think to a large extent, you've heard a lot about how COVID has accelerated changes in our economy. Amazon's continued ascendance, other kind of new services like that. But from my perspective, what we're seeing at the Yard, but also to my expectation, is that the thing that has accelerated most is labor market changes, and that to a degree that I don't think the city has fully reckoned with, even when it gets back to full employment, even when that whatever color line it was, yellow line, crosses the number of jobs that we had just before COVID, they're going to be different jobs, and they're going to be higher skilled jobs. And we're seeing that. We're starting to see a glimmer in our tenants of them starting to rehire. They're certainly having trouble finding talent. A part of that is because tenants who we are accustomed to seeing ask for, incoming people at a certain level of talent, they're now asking for a higher level of talent because they've automated away from some of those lower level positions when they couldn't have people physically on site. They figured out how to do it. And so I think that is, to some extent, just a fundamental truth in the labor market that we have to grapple with. And I think the policy response, as I'm sure this audience will completely agree, is really around not just workforce development set of initiatives, but a very different set of workforce development initiatives, one that really grapples with not simply placing people into entry-level jobs, but really asking what are those entry-level jobs now and a year from now, and how do we really get people prepared for it? We at the Navy Yard have tried to prototype a couple different programs that we've now offered up to the city. CUNY has a new program which we developed here and ran for the better part of the pandemic, where we took internships and moved them from a traditional internship to one that was very deep and during the summer or winter, and then offered a wage subsidy for 4 months after the internship period was over. And if the intern was hired back full time, and what we targeted CUNY students, local residents, and what we found was a 50% attachment rate. 50% of those interns got hired back full time into those kinds of jobs that we're seeing companies looking for, not the entry-level jobs of 3 or 4 years ago. They're entering in as project managers, 3D printing technicians, junior landscape architects, CNC machining operators. And so I think the city has to really look at, okay, as we recover, what jobs are going to be on offer in the recovery, and how do we match people to those jobs of the future, not the jobs of the last recovery.
Yeah, thank you all. And David, I think your point really cues us up for the next question in particular, which is, how have the boroughs, specifically, obviously in this case, Brooklyn and Staten Island businesses, shifted their talent approach during the pandemic, and as we shift into this kind of post-pandemic economy, crossing our fingers as I say that, but also, what trends in hiring practices have you noticed businesses shift to as a result to not just the pandemic, but also, obviously, to your point, there being a shift in the need of these different businesses in terms of their talent. And anyone can jump in here. We don't have to go in any specific order.
I mean, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, businesses are creatures of habit. So a lot of times you don't see these great changes that happen overnight. Of course, everyone was posting everything online and trying to do online interviews, which is just what you have to do during the pandemic. But for a large part, when I talk to the employers, especially people who have been in business for 20 or 30 years, they only know one thing. They need people to come to them with their resumes and do an in-person interview. which makes it very hard to shift practices to what's happening during COVID. Right now, we're seeing people post jobs everywhere. They're using every single platform that they can think of, but it's not working. Indeed is notorious for clicks, but not finding talent. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources on the island like Brooklyn does, so we don't have all of those workforce partners that are building the pipeline and bringing us their talent, which is making it very hard for a lot of our employers to actually find talent.
I mean, a couple of things. So let's start with a baseline of acknowledging that some percentage, and it's a hard number to pin down, but some percentage of businesses have already closed permanently, right? So in some communities, 20%, upwards of maybe a third in other communities, depending upon what I call microtrends that may have impacted those specific communities. Then you've got significant temporary wage pressure, in part because we've had rapid reopening and people are trying to staff up. And the labor just may not be here in some cases, right? We've seen in some boroughs, not necessarily Brooklyn, but in some boroughs, people have moved away. We've seen some sectors that were intertwined, right? So the restaurant hospitality sector and let's say the theater sector, right? And there's a base of workers that have not come back yet, that would have normally had filled some of that. So there is wage pressure. So some of the smaller employers tried at least to offer hiring incentives. Right now, hiring incentive upfront doesn't lock them in to a longer term higher wage that they can over time sustain. And they do have in some cases they do have a little bit of cash up front, right? So if PPP 1 and 2 hit them okay and they were qualified and they received it, if they're a restaurant and they were one of the 25% that did get a restaurant revitalization grant, if they've accessed the small business grant program, they may have some upfront cash to work with to offer a hiring incentive. So we've seen hiring incentives, but we haven't seen businesses wanting to lock themselves into the higher wage given the temporary sort of wage pressure. So that's something to track. I mean, we focused on the jobs and we focused right now on the industries and the unemployment rate, but we should also be looking, and this is another assignment for James, like let's start tracking sort of wages and wage pressure across this particular recovery, because I think that's an issue. Look, the small businesses are in a different place, and they're all struggling. And how we get out of the evictions moratorium, because many of them, at least a third, owe back rent, is going to determine their fate in some instances. The childcare issue is a huge concern. Remember, the childcare sector is one of those sectors that are facing labor shortages, so it multiplies the problem, because as more and more parents need childcare in order to get back to work, there's less and less childcare available. So these are definitely some of the things that we have to look at over time, and that's why Regina's point about reopening the schools is like a key. It's like key and critical. Like it truly is. If we go backwards and we have to sort of shut down again, and we're doing remote school, like I don't know what it's going to mean for some of the parents that were anticipating going back after Labor Day. So still a lot of things out there that it's unclear.
David, Regina, anything you want to add to that? That's fine. We can move on to the next question. I think both Brian and Randy really addressed that. And so, I think this was kind of highlighted a bit in Brian's point around kind of the sophistication of, let's say, the talent networks and workforce development organizations that exist in Brooklyn. But still, there is this kind of disconnect that the small business sector has to developing and establishing relationships with training providers. And there's a variety of different reasons for that, one of which Brian highlighted specifically, which is just kind of old school methodology around how you recruit talent. But beyond that, what can workforce development organizations do to enhance this relationship and make it more effective between the businesses and talent development organizations? And what practices, if any, have you noticed that businesses have adopted that will enhance relationships with workforce development providers. So anyone can jump in to start.
I think I mean, there's, I think, a lot of different things that go into that, and there's no one simple answer. What we've found is that you know, the elephant in this room is CUNY, and that and so they're extraordinarily important when you're talking about the talent pipeline for any New York City company, but particularly in the outer boroughs, and maybe less so for hospitality jobs. But we've found that playing an intermediary role between our local CUNY campuses and the businesses here at the Yard has been extraordinarily important. I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs we talk to who, you know, when we talk to them about City Tech, which is literally 3 blocks from the Navy Yard, they don't know that it's there, and it's quite striking. There's a real desire to engage and to find local talent, but there just isn't that connective tissue, and that CUNY itself, given its own staffing issues, has a hard time making those connections. And so I think, you know, one interesting role that we've played, I think, to quite a strong effect here has just been as a matchmaker between CUNY and the businesses, not necessarily trying to do the training ourselves. We do trainings ourselves, not necessarily trying to do the trainings ourselves, but really just saying, like, there is a well of people right down the street, and they're not making that connection, and we can help do that, because we have credibility on both sides, right? We have credibility both with the businesses, and we have credibility with the administration and staff at CUNY, where if just a business person just walks into CUNY, there may not be that same credibility, and vice versa.
Yeah, and my work with City Tech echoes David's comments. Sadly, through all of the budget cuts over the past several years, there's so few opportunities for internships at City Tech. So few students are really prepared for what the job market is like. They haven't seen the job market. We here at the partnership do open offices. Obviously, the past year and a half, we've done these virtually, trying to connect our Brooklyn startups with students. These sessions are incredibly well attended, which is really fantastic, but there's so few opportunities for students to see what startups in the tech space actually do day in, day out. And sadly, in terms of internship programs, there just isn't the infrastructure at CUNY. I actually am part of a pretty active internship program, not at City Tech, but up at City College, because we enjoy that relationship. And the students we get are ones who want to do place-based work like what we do day in, day out. But that's a very small slice of what goes on. What I see is the biggest success at City Tech is in some of the programs, like their own hospitality programs, which really feed into management, and also a couple of their comp sci programs that have direct links to larger companies. But that, again, it's all, as David has mentioned, this is all about scale.
Ryan, can I ask you, before you jump in, and Randy, the same for you, can you also consider the providers that are non-CUNY organizations in this response as well? I think it's also important to understand CUNY plays an incredible role and an important role, and it obviously is one that we care very deeply about. But, you know, consider the community-based organizations that play a role in this process as well.
Well, that's the hardest thing. Most of the businesses are not connected to the workforce world. In fact, when we say workforce, they don't even know what that means. The chambers act like a hub in so many different ways. Prior to COVID, the Staten Island Chamber decided that we wanted to help our businesses by launching a job board. You know, we have a job board. It's free for any business on the island. In fact, we actually get businesses from off island and other boroughs and from Jersey that will post on our job board to recruit talent. for their business. Our job board has, a pretty decent following. We get I think it's about 1,500 unique views a week, and we have 125 postings every week. We took it to another level, and we contacted all of the workforce providers, and the chambers do not get any money to do workforce development. So we said to them that you need connections with businesses, and our businesses need talent. This year, we kind of took it to a different way, and we helped a lot of the summer youth providers, the Advance and Earn providers, Train and Earn. We worked with CUNY Service Corps. We worked with CUNY's workforce federal programs, so that we could help them make the partnerships with the business. And it's great on both ends. It helps those entities, the nonprofits that are running their workforce programs, make better inroads into the business community, which is going to have dividend payoff for them. But it also shows all of the businesses that the chamber is not just doing things, typically like they would for their businesses. We're doing it with members, with non-members. The goal is that a stronger workforce company, a stronger workforce community is going to benefit the local businesses, which is going to put more money back into the local businesses. So it's a cyclical effect. And I think that if more workforce providers partnered with their chambers in the other borough, I think it would just be beautiful. Right now, I have interns from Queens, and I mean, it's fantastic because of virtual things that we're able to work with so many people and have them work with our local businesses.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. So we, like the Navy Yard, have a small business staffing service. The program's called Good Help. We've been doing it for 20 years. It really does aggregate the public workforce system, because we work with all of the providers that want to be part of the network, which most of them here in Brooklyn and quite frankly around the city. Scale is part of the problem. I mean, I was on the other side of the equation, as you know, Joey, and as a workforce provider, particularly when it comes to government contracts, you're under pressure to make such high volume number of placements that the small businesses with the onesies and twosies, it's almost not even cost effective for you to pursue it. So when an intermediary like the Navy Yard or the chambers can play that role and deal with the onesies and the twosies and the small businesses who are only going to hire a couple and sort of aggregate that, then it sort of makes some sense. I will say, if there's any policy folks on the webinar right now, look, we missed a huge opportunity. We missed a huge opportunity to invest in OJT, on the job training. The state, I don't know why it decided it was going to cut it out a couple of years ago in terms of the budget, and we pushed hard to restore that. Look, some employers, especially under the current circumstances, they'll hire somebody without a lot of skills and work with them on the job to get them up to speed. And by the way, it doesn't, the traditional OJT model doesn't cut out the providers, because remember, it's a hybrid model. It requires on-the-job training and some formalized training by a third-party provider, right? So it could have been a win-win across the workforce system if the state would have just decided to invest in it. A version of that James Parrott, CWE, and I pursued was the wage subsidy program. We did this after 9/11. Wage subsidies would have been a way to get people off of unemployment and back into the workforce, into the labor force, without having the employers fitting the bill for the inflated wage. And once again, we made the pitch to policymakers, state and city, and it fell on deaf ears. So everyone was looking for these creative solutions. Well, there were two solutions that we knew worked already, and they chose not to invest in those, of all the things that they chose to invest in. So that was unfortunate. That was unfortunate for sure. But the workforce system long-term, I mean, it's right to sort of focus on the emerging industries as we go through this transition, right? So in Brooklyn, people don't realize this, but tech is our fastest growing industry, right? We have the most tech startups of anywhere in the country, even more so than San Francisco. Once again, not the big guys, these are tech startups, but places like the Navy Yard, like are home to many of these new creative tech companies that are going to need to tap into a local workforce. But is the workforce system prepared to kind of feed that through effective training? So we've got a dual mission right now. In the short term, we need to get people back to work. We need to figure out how the public workforce system can be leveraged in order to make that happen. And in the long term, are we creating the pipelines in the emerging industries that we need in order to ensure that the companies that are setting up shop here will have access to that skilled workforce long-term.
That's great. I really wish we had more time, but we've reached the conclusion of the panel discussion. We're going to head over to workshops. But David, Brian, Regina, Randy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and perspectives with the members and partners who joined us today. We always appreciate your time and really grateful for you guys to be a part of this and look forward to partnering with you further in the future. So thank you all.